When someone has traumatized you and they won't take responsibility for their behavior, it is very easy to get stuck in the victim role. And it doesn't matter whether the trauma happened 30 years ago or 3 weeks ago. So how do you take your trauma seriously and still move on with life in a way where you can be a strong, powerful, healthy person? Hi everybody, this is Greg from Heart Tools, where we make it simple to build great relationships. And when we have relational conflict or relational strain and it doesn't get resolved and it doesn't improve, it can be one of the most painful and also confusing parts in life. And in our last video, we outlined that when this is going on, there may be one of three different things happening. And in that video, we covered the first two situations. The first situation is you may have gotten bumped. The second situation is there may be real conflict and you need to ask the other person to change behavior that's inappropriate. And in this video, we're going to talk about the third situation. The third situation you might find yourself in when relationships are really bad and they can't improve is you may have been traumatized. So you may have experienced some form of abuse. You may have been sexually harassed. You may have been bullied. You may be in a marriage and your spouse had an affair, or you may be in a marriage and your spouse gambled away all your money and all your savings, and now you're in crisis. These kinds of things are traumatizing. So let me give you a thumbnail sketch of what it looks like when trauma resolves well as it can, so that we can see what happens when it gets derailed. So the first three steps of dealing with trauma are your responsibility if you've been traumatized. The first step to take if you've been traumatized is to protect your own safety, to put yourself in a position where you cannot be harmed any longer. The second step is to focus in on your own healing, to get the resources and the help that you need to become whole and strong again, because trauma can be very damaging. The third step is forgiveness. And let me talk about this for a second, because we get this wrong quite a bit. Forgiveness is not reconciliation. Just because you've forgiven someone doesn't mean that you're going to get back in a relationship with them. What forgiveness is canceling a debt. And here's why it's critical, because if you don't do this, it's really hard to get out of the victim role in the triangle and get back up on the stairway where you're powerful and moving forward. Because if someone has traumatized you, they owe you something, right? And it's very easy to get stuck in that way of thinking that you stole my childhood from me. You owe me, right? You stole my innocence. You owe me. You stole my career from me. You owe me, right? And it's easy to get stuck in this idea that I can't move forward until you pay me back what you owe me. And that can become a big part of your heart, this idea that you're owed this thing, and you're thinking about it all the time. And the person who's traumatized you hasn't thought about you once in the last year, right? And so in order to get out of that victim role, you simply have to cancel that debt and say, yes, you do owe me this, but I'm not going to expect it back from you at all. I'm going to move on I'm going to cancel that debt, and I'm going to move on with my life, and I don't need you to do anything, and I don't need your permission, and I don't need you to change your behavior before I move on with life. And that's what forgiveness does for you. It frees you up from the victim role, and it puts you back in charge of your life. Now, once you have done these three things, then that opens up the possibility of reconciliation. But it doesn't make reconciliation a given, because the person who's harmed you also has to do three things. The first thing is they have to admit that they've harmed you and take responsibility for that. They have to say, yeah, I abused you. Yeah, I bullied you. Yes, my alcoholism has damaged our family and put us in crisis, right? Whatever the trauma is, they have to admit that they have done that. The second step in reconciliation is they have to change their behavior. It's not enough that they admit it and that they promise they'll change. In order to reconcile, you really need to see new behavior. It's not enough to say, yeah, I'm sorry, I'll never drink again, right? You have to see months and months and months of sobriety and involvement in AA or Celebrate Recovery or some resource like that. Because what happens is you cannot trust someone until you see that their behavior has changed. And then the third thing that has to happen is they have got to be willing to make amends for the harm that they've done. Once they've done those three things, then reconciliation is possible. It is fascinating that even the writers of the New Testament, who focus so much on God's forgiveness and God's desire and willingness to forgive, still emphasize that if you want to get back in relationship with a forgiving God, you have to admit what you have done wrong, which they call confessing your sins. You have to change your behavior, which they call repentance. And you have to be willing to make amends for the harm that you've done. Now, that's just a quick, simple thumbnail sketch of what happens when trauma resolves well and ends up in reconciliation. But just as not all conflict resolves, not all trauma resolves into reconciliation and restored relationship. And here's where this process of reconciliation gets derailed, is instead of doing those three things of admitting, changing behavior, and making amends, what the person who's traumatized you wants to do is they want to take a step down and deal with it as a conflict. That's the first step. This is a conflict. And so maybe you've been with someone and you say, hey, your alcoholism is destroying the family. I am moving out. And until I've seen that you have changed your behavior and gotten some help and taken this seriously, I can't be in relationship with you. So the ball's in your court. You need to deal with this. And instead of doing that, they want to treat it as a conflict. And so they'll talk to people and say, yeah, she's just not ready to work on our marriage. I know I have some problems, but she won't take responsibility for her problems. It takes two to tango, right? And if she's not willing to do her part, instead of admitting, yeah, I've traumatized this relationship, I've traumatized you, they want to treat it as an unresolved conflict that you're not doing your part because you've said, I'm not going to be in the same room with you until this gets resolved, right? And then they'll go down another step and say, the reason you won't deal with that conflict is because you're so wounded. Well, we all know how sensitive she is, right? We all know what a perfectionist she is. We all know how stubborn and prideful she is, and she can't even admit her part of the problem. And so instead of dealing with the trauma as a trauma, they'll go down a step and deal with it as unresolved conflict that you will not take your part in because you are so wounded. And so you come back to this principle again, that you are responsible for your behavior, not other people's reaction or response to your behavior. And so if your behavior is you are keeping yourself safe, you are taking care of your healing, and you are forgiving, there is nothing for you to take responsibility for. On the other hand, if a person has traumatized you and they want to make it your problem because you won't deal with conflict, and it's because you're so wounded and you're getting bumped, they're not taking responsibility for their behavior. So there is a situation again where someone who's not taking responsibility for their behavior is someone that you cannot be in relationship with. The principle of reciprocity, again, your job is to take responsibility for your behavior. You cannot make someone take responsibility for theirs. What you can do is pay attention. Who's taking responsibility for their behavior? Those are people I can trust. Those are people I can build a relationship, and those are people I can move forward with. And we need to do this, or we drift down into the victim role of the triangle. When we minimize or shut off those relationships, however important they are to us, and grieve that loss, is when we can get back on the stairway and start moving forward in healthy relationships with people who take responsibility for their behavior, and our life can move forward. As you look at this stairway, you'll notice that what it represents is the reality that in each conflict and even in each trauma, there is a possibility for you to become a stronger, more powerful person. And sometimes this happens because the conflict resolves and the relationship improves. Sometimes this happens because there's reconciliation between you and the person who traumatized you. And you can do everything in your power to make that happen, but you cannot control what the other person does. So sometimes you become stronger and more powerful because you have chosen not to be in relationship with people who will not take responsibility for their behavior. You've chosen not to be in relationship with people who you are in conflict with, who want to treat you like you're a weak, wounded person getting bumped. You've chosen not to be in relationship with people who've traumatized you and want to pretend that this is a conflict that needs to be resolved, and you both have your own fault, and you're not engaging because you're so weak, right? And you've decided not to be in relationship with that kind of person. And that is part, at Heart Tools, we call that your people picker has improved, right? We need to pick healthy people to be in relationship because you are only as healthy as the people that you allow into your heart. And so what happens in these moments on the stairway with conflict and especially with trauma is when you do your part, right? When you protect your own safety, when you take care of your own healing and get resources and help and support for that. And then when you go through the painful and difficult process of forgiving the person who traumatized you and saying, I've just canceled that debt. I'm going to move on with my own life, and you don't owe me anything. I'm not waiting for you. I'm free of you. I'm going to go on with my own life. When that happens, you develop resiliency. And boy, resiliency is such a powerful character trait to have if you want to have a strong, powerful life. Now, in our next video, we are going to deal with one more aspect of trauma that can potentially have you landing up in the victim spot of the triangle. And that is this: when you are in a group with the person who's traumatized you, you're in a family, you're in a work team, you're in a church, you work at a police department, you work at a school, whatever the group is. When you're in a group with a person who's traumatized you, you can end up not only losing your relationship with that person, but with the entire group as well. And it's extremely painful, and it's not uncommon, unfortunately. And so we're going to talk about why that happens and what you can do about it. But for this video, here's what I would encourage you to practice. In the areas of your life where perhaps you've been traumatized, where it's gone beyond conflict and it's actually trauma, what I would like for you to do is ask yourself, what's my next step in the part that I'm responsible for, right? So your next step may be to protect your own safety and to put yourself in a position where this person's behavior can no longer impact you or harm you. Your next step may be to focus in on your own healing and to get the help and resources you need to become whole again. Or your next step may be the difficult and painful process of forgiving the person who traumatized you, so that you're no longer waiting for them to do something so that you can move on with your life, but instead make that decision. I'm going to cancel that debt, and I'm going to move on and become a strong, resilient, unstoppable person living the life I want to live. Simple steps. Practice, practice, practice. That's what Heart Tools is all about.